Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Real National Dialogue with myself, Jonathan Mokes, and Paul Berkowitz. Paul, how are you doing in what appears to be a nice rainy Johannesburg?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Jonathan. Yes, as you said, we're hunkering down and enjoying being indoors. It is quite wet and cold here. How are things in London?
Well, London is, as ever, nice and cold, as they always say. The UK has 3 months of winter and 9 months of bad weather. So I've just priced it in now. But we are talking on Monday, the 24th of November, 24 hours, or just less than 24 hours after Cyril Ramaphosa formally closed the G20 Leaders Summit, which was held in Johannesburg, South Africa, over the past weekend. So it would be remiss of us not to talk about that today. So we will talk about that. Also on the agenda is some very interesting new public polling, which was released by the Social Research Foundation via the Common Sense newspaper last week. Again, very important to discuss that, given that we focus our time on elections. And given the subject of elections, we have a massive set of by-elections this coming Wednesday, with 8 being contested in the Eastern Cape, Northern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, and Gauteng. So quite a bit to dig into there. So without further ado, let's get cracking and chat through the G20. So, Paul, lots of, I think, good vibes, if I can use that term, for South Africa after the weekend. The week was dominated leading up to the Leaders Summit by the back and forth between South Africa and the US, and in particular, the US's opposition to a leaders declaration because the US boycotted the G20 summit on the basis of this ridiculous misinformation about white Afrikaner genocide. The US were very upset that South Africa was intending to, together with partners, release a leaders declaration. They really tried to make it a chairperson statement. But I think in a massive coup for South Africa, the leaders declaration was adopted before day one of the leaders summit. And that, I think, set the tone for what appears to have been a positive weekend.
Yes, agree with you, Jonathan. Definitely a diplomatic coup for Ramaphosa and South Africa. And adopting the Leaders' Declaration on day one was highly unusual. There was a lot of behind the scenes negotiation and compromise so that all the nations that were there, obviously everyone minus the US, could agree on the terms, could agree on the language, and adopt the Leaders' Resolution. What seems to have happened this year, Jonathan, is that despite the stated reasons for boycotting the G20, the US has done that I think this year at other multilateral gatherings, boycotted the proceedings and then tried to join the party near the end, only to oppose any resolutions and water them down. And what Ramaphosa did was, he played a very straight bat. He refused to entertain the US joining at a later stage I guess, uh, dissolve any work that had been done by the other nations. And as you know, um, South Africa also refused a formal ceremonial handover of the G20 leadership to the US. I think Ramaphosa's language, I don't have it here, but it was quite clear that they're not going to take what should be a quite ceremonial and diplomatic process and cheapen it through juniorization, and they'll hand over the leadership at a more low-key meeting without the cameras and the microphones. So the US has been left pretty much isolated.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think the intention for the US was for Ramaphosa to hand over the leaders' declaration and hand over the presidency, because of course the US take it on for 2026. the US proposed their deputy ambassador, or charge d'affaires, to come and get it, and South Africa sort of said absolutely refused. It's not protocol. There were reports over the weekend that there were some attempts to get the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer to accept the declaration on behalf of the US, but I think that was refused. So apparently now this week there's going to be a very low-key ceremony at the at DIRCO Department, the South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation, to hand over to the US Deputy Ambassador. So, definitely a bit of a snub for the US. As you say, Paul, it's definitely a US playbook, because they also weren't at COP30 in Belém in Brazil recently. There's a lot of multilateral meetings they don't attend, but then they try and steal the thunder. So one of the big things that Trump obviously did last week was release or propose the so-called 28-point plan to end the war between Russia and Ukraine, as a way of kind of dominating or countering or competing with the agenda of G20. But it seems that that also failed a bit, because given that there were a number of, in particular, European allies present in Johannesburg, they sat down together to discuss the 28-point plan, the flaws with it, and sort of develop their own sort of platform and response to it in a multilateral setting where the US wasn't present. So it did seem that the US picked up a bit of a bloody nose. They, of course, won't see it like that. But I mean, it is a stated policy aim for the US to be increasingly isolationist. But at the same time, it did appear that Trump was trying to have his cake and eat it, but was scuppered in those attempts by Ramaphosa and the South African government, but also supported by the solidarity he received from the governments that were there. And I think, important to note, I mean, so obviously Trump wasn't there. Xi Jinping wasn't present, but the premier of China, who's effectively like the prime minister, was. I think the Mexican president didn't make it, and the Argentine president didn't make it, but Argentina's foreign affairs minister was there. I think it was largely Argentina that were adopting the Trump mantle and sort of fought for some watering down of the language in the ultimate leaders declaration. But yeah, overall, probably just a generally good weekend for, I mean, take away South Africa, a good weekend for multilateralism, I suppose, for the so-called middle powers, and a good demonstration that it sometimes doesn't require the US to always be involved.
Yes. I think apart from playing our hand so well as South Africa, uh, we need to be realistic and say, yes, multilateralism looks healthy. South Africa demonstrated that we can host and we can cooperate and we can bring out a declaration and do everything with this existential US threat hanging over our heads. But just because there's increased cooperation doesn't mean that we got everything our own way. When you mentioned the Russia-Ukraine war, this was the first declaration since the start of the war where there was no dedicated clause to addressing Russia and Ukraine. Rather, that conflict was kind of subsumed and bundled together with Sudan, DRC, and Palestine. There was also pushback from the other countries about adopting very strong rules on fossil fuels and ending subsidies to them. So there was give and take, even with all the adults in the room working together. We didn't achieve everything we wanted to, but I think that was a realistic outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. So so well done to, I suppose, the South African government for pulling this off and for navigating some very turbulent waters. At the end of the day, though, we're a publication on Substack, and when we do our podcast, we focus a lot on domestic politics. We're not a foreign policy podcast, although foreign policy does reinforce that. what I'm particularly interested in, and maybe this is the beginning of a little bit of a long segue, Paul, into the polling conversation, is the G20 was very much the big focus of the South African government's year. Understandably, it was a big moment. It's the first time an African nation has hosted the G20. But there was a lot of commentary that, the government of national unity would stay intact until at least the G20 was over because of the involvement of so many different ministers on the various commissions and preparations for the summit. There's also been a lot of discussion that Cyril himself was seeing it as a big marker, so his future was very, very much tied to G20. And then, of course, me being maybe the so-called Debbie Downer in the room, the G20s happened. There was a lot of positivity. It was buttressed by a wonderful Springbok victory over Ireland on Saturday. But at the end of the day, there was still a lot of crime that happened in South Africa over the weekend. There's still a lot of people that can't put three meals on the table. There's still a lot of corruption going on. There's still the Mkhwanazi Commission of Inquiry. The domestic problems that Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC-led Government of National Unity have not gone away and are very much present. And now that the G20 is over, we very, very much turn our attention to 2026, which is the year of the local government election. And I mean, maybe firstly, before we go into specifically looking at the Social Research Foundation polling, do you think, Paul, that the G20 has given Ramaphosa or the government any particular domestic boost? Do you think it's worked in their favor? From a government of national unity perspective, it would seem that the GNU is probably more stable than it has been for some time, especially if you look back to the budget. So there's stability in the government. There's obviously forward-looking behavior from the government. But how do you think things are positioned?
Well, if you want to play the Debbie Downer role, Jonathan, let me then by default look at the glass half full perspective. As you said, the G20 has been a boost for the country, for Ramaphosa within the GNU and within the ANC. But there are other positive things that we haven't mentioned. We had an interest rate cut last week. We've had a sovereign debt ratings upgrade by Standard and Poor. You mentioned the budget, and so to contrast and in contradistinction to that torturous process where it looked like the ANC and the DA would divorce and tensions were very high. I think there's some clear evidence in the medium-term budget policy statement, and we wrote as much, I think the last week or the week before last, that this was a budget by consensus. You can see the fingerprints of other GNU members in the medium-term budget policy statement with a greater push towards public-private partnerships, to a greater push for the private sector involvement than before. And we also know, you and I have heard via the grapevine, that although we haven't seen all the evidence yet, Operation Vulindlela is bearing fruit. It is a little bit more of a cleanup and professionalism in national government. We're not going to speak about Johannesburg today. It hasn't, unfortunately, trickled down or filtered down to local government. That's a whole other problem. But I would say, yes, the GNU is healthier than it's been uh, since maybe before February and the budget this year. The unknown factor for me, Jonathan, is all of the ANC members of parliament that had a lot to say at the ANC NEC discussions about how they want the DA kicked out. We haven't checked the pulse of ANC MPs and members yet about how they feel about their GNU partners. But all other signs for me point towards a stronger national coalition. I will take a punt and say the GNU will remain intact until at least February next year. It's not much of a gamble. It's unlikely that there'll be anything extreme or conclusive that's done between now and February.
Yeah. I think that's a very, very safe bet, Paul. So I would definitely agree. And thank you for outlining the I suppose the reasons to feel good. There have been some very, very positive developments of late. I don't know if you also mentioned the quarterly labor force survey. I mean, there was a little bit of a downturn in the unemployment rate, still a long way to go. The
Yeah.
medium-term budget policy statement was definitely a different feel, if I can use that language in terms of how people felt and how they responded, and the GNU seemed pretty united. But as we always say, and overuse the dreadful cliche that a week is a long time in politics, so much can happen. And going into next year, it is an election year. And on that note, we always love any polling that comes out here on the Real National Dialogue and on Substack via the South Africa Brief. And it was really exciting to see a poll released last week. So it was published on the publication called Common Sense. And this was the latest Social Research Foundation poll run by Frans Cronje. So the poll was conducted by Victory Research between the 27th of October and the 14th of November. So pretty current stuff. The sample size was 1,002, so the poll has a margin of error of about 4 percentage points. And to get on to the important stuff, the results of the poll place the ANC nationally at 37%, the DA on 32%, MK on 8%, the EFF on 7%, and the IFP on 6%. The published results to date don't specify where the other parties are, but I think if my maths is correct, there's probably about 10% for those other parties uh, to compete for. Normally, and in the past, the Social Research Foundation has modeled turnout on 58%. It indicated that it modeled turnout for this particular poll on 53%. It asks turnout questions in its surveys. And these results show quite a bit of movement from when the Social Research Foundation last released some polling in June. Firstly, I mean, I think the DA will be the party that's most pleased by this polling result because they've risen sharply by 6 points. Again, I must put the caveat that there are different turnout scenarios. So the June turnout scenario was 58%. This one's 53%, but the DA has gone from 26% to 32%. The ANC's dropped by 3 percentage points. What for me is a really significant data point is that if you compare the Social Research Foundation's June poll with this one, MK would have dropped by 10 points, and the EFF would have risen by 4 points, the IFP remaining largely the same. So Paul, what are your initial impressions and thoughts on the basis of this?
Well, the first one is to agree with you, Jonathan. This is a very good poll result for the DA. It puts, on the face of it, it puts the party within 5 percentage points of the ANC. But we'll talk in a second. Local government, obviously, um, aggregated percentages mean a lot less than national and provincial. The MK drop, I don't know if it's surprising to me. I think it tracks a little bit the by-election results. I think some of the internal debates we have and other analysts, when we look at the by-election results, which we'll get to, uh, is the progress that's been made by MK, is that a sign of momentum? Is that just a hangover from the results where they did very well in large areas in last year's election? This would be a big shock for them. This would suggest that finally the party's internal chaos is having an effect on the perception by the public and potential voters. I never was completely sold on the previous polling results that had the EFF down at 3%. I thought having fallen from 15, 14 to 9% in the actual election and then down to 3%, that was too much of a drop.
Mm.
So 7% feels more realistic to me. IFP feels all right. What's interesting, which is just the back of the envelope calculation that I've made over the years, Jonathan, is that up until last year, there was a quite a high concentration of the vote in the top three parties. And pick the top three from any national provincial election year. If it was COPE in 2009, if it was the EFF in 2014, or even the New National Party back in 1990. Historically, the top three parties, which has always been the ANC and then the DA and the third one, have shared about 80 or 85% of the vote. What we've seen now with the MK breakaway is that we're looking at the top five parties, the ANC, the DA, MK, EFF, IFP, and by my calculations, together the top five have 19%. So still concentrated, but much less so than it has been historically, an indication of the increased fragmentation of the vote. As I said, and I don't think we can get into the weeds right now, these aggregated results will have to be adjusted municipality by municipality, metro by metro. So, for example, in Johannesburg, I think the ANC and the DA gap could be a lot narrower than even this aggregated poll suggests. But that when it comes to Tshwane, for example, you will see a rise in Action SA, who've done very well off their mayor, Nosiphi Moyo, and she's their greatest asset in campaigning in that metro. Ekurhuleni, I do think the DA will run the ANC a lot closer, particularly since we've seen over the last 2 or 3 weeks the revelations that corruption and political murder and violence in the Ekurhuleni is a lot worse than we thought it was. And last point from me for now, Jonathan, I was interested in the favorability polls, which obviously look at the net favorability of the major parties' leadership. That when it came to within the ANC, Paul Mashatile is very unpopular, also among ANC voters. He is not second in the favorability polls behind Ramaphosa. He's behind Josienso Ramakgopa. He's behind Fikile Mbalula. The only person he seems to be beating out at the moment is Senzo Mchunu. And that's interesting for me to see what effect that might have still quite far away on the ANC's Electoral Conference 2027.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, good flag on the favorabilities, and I think this is the argument against Mashatile is that unlike Ramaphosa, for all his faults, Ramaphosa does raise the ANC up. Mashatile probably brings it down, and I think we've seen that across some other polls that have been released in the past year or so. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm pretty aligned on your analysis. I mean, I'm sure the Social Research Foundation, which looks to be the only organization that on a regular basis will be producing regular public polls, I'm sure they will, closer to the election, release some metro polls. But I think the national trend does show that probably in Johannesburg, I would agree the gap is narrow, and potentially the DA is ahead of the ANC in Johannesburg. Tshwane will be fascinating. I think the DA traditionally has always been neck and neck with the ANC, but you do have Action SA. I think what will be very interesting for me is also Nelson Mandela Bay, what the situation is there. And that also brings me to a point that what this poll is not going to be able to show us is how the PA is doing in the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape. We know that in by-elections they've been really, really performing well, and potentially also in some particular areas in Gauteng, they may have an outsized influence or kingmaker capacity. But yeah, I think the MK stat is interesting. There's been a lot of analysis about MK's internal strife, which most recently culminated in the fiasco in Parliament with John Hlophe firing Colleen Makubela and then Hlophe himself being suspended by Zuma for taking out. And now we've got Tony Yengeni in as second deputy president. I mean, it's absolute chaos. Is that catching up with MK? Or is MK also losing the relevance game? They're also, let's be honest, not performing well as an official opposition in Parliament. So, that also is hurting them. And yes, I think the EFF percentage right now probably is right. But as ever, a poll is a poll. It's just a snapshot or a prediction at a point in time. What's going to be more important is to look at the trends. But what the trends do show, in terms of the top two parties, the ANC and the DA, is that the ANC continues to struggle, the DA continues to improve. And the DA, I think, has done a pretty good job in consolidating its position in the government of national unity, managing to project itself as a kind of opposition party still within the government, and the ANC's, I would say, cruising for a bruising next year at the current trajectory.
Yes. Just to add one more caveat to the numbers, Jonathan, just over 1,000, the sample size of just over 1,000 respondents is a bit on the low side. And assuming that it was weighted to be nationally demographically representative, there is a good chance that the polling might have missed the dynamics where MK is strong, because MK, based on last year's election results, is still largely a regional party. A very large percentage of the votes coming just from KZN. And it's possible that the polling may have missed the concentration of MK votes and may be underestimating where the party is. As you said, we will wait. We'll eagerly anticipate other polls and see where the momentum is.
Yeah, no, a good point. I mean, to be fair to the Social Research Foundation, they did, I think, pick MK's rise together with a few others before the election. So maybe this is, but there's always outliers in polls, and it's always important in terms of trends. Now, moving from polls to actual elections, because in addition to polls, what gives us a bit of an insight into where voters are by-elections. And sadly, we've had a too long a break in terms of by-elections over the past few weeks, but the Independent Electoral Commission is back with a bang this Wednesday, and has 8 by-elections. And Paul, as ever, to use the parlance of the G20, you can be our Sherpa through this. And let me maybe set the scene for 3 by-elections that are taking place in the Eastern Cape, and then we can move province by province. So there's Ward 10 in Makana in the Eastern Cape. So the ANC holds this ward. They will be defending it against a somewhat crowded field, including, interestingly, the SACP, which to date has been contesting in Limpopo, but it makes its debut, maybe not its debut, but a rare appearance in the Eastern Cape. The DA, the EFF, the PA, and the Makana Citizens Front will be contesting. In 2021, the ANC had won this ward, sorry, with 67%, and they got 68% in 2024. So relatively strong ward. Then Ward 2, Coega, Eastern Cape. This is a very marginal ward for the DA at a local government election. So the DA edged the ward in 2021 with 48 to the ANC's 43.5, call it 44. And then in a national election, the DA won the ward with 54 4% of the vote to the ANC's 26. The PA will be contesting this ward together with the ANC. The PA got just under 10% in the general election, so that will be interesting to watch as to how the DA handle that in a very marginal contest. And then there's another marginal ward, Ward 2 in Kokama, which the ANC won in 2021 with 46% of the vote to the DA's 26 and independents 20. But the 2024 provincial results suggest a very, very close race. ANC winning 34%, the PA winning 32%, and the DA 26. And of course, the PA will be contesting this ward. So, Paul, guide us through what you think the landscape is in those Eastern Cape wards. All very interesting, very different. And where's the smart money?
Well, let's start with the easiest one, Jonathan. The Makana Ward, Ward 10 in the Eastern Cape, that's the municipality that includes Grahamstown. I think a safe bet that the ANC will retain that ward. They've got close to 70% in 2021 and in last year's provincial vote. The Makana Citizens Front, as you said, they did well in 2021, but as you said as well, it's a very crowded field. The opposition parties will probably take each other out. It will be interesting to look at the final numbers to see whether the EFF, the DA, Makana Citizens Front are growing or not. I don't expect big things from the SACP. You may have seen last week there were rumblings from Bladen Zimande that the SACP should stop contesting elections independently and should rejoin the tripartite alliance and work as one unit for the ANC next year. But we'll see. We'll see if and when the SACP decide that going it alone is not worth it for them. The other two wards, Wards 2 in Kocha and Kokama, it's going to be very hard to predict, Jonathan. I think the PA is always the unknown quantity. The ANC, on the face of it, should retain the Kocha ward. I'm sorry, on the face of it, the DA, the DA is close to 50% and will hope that the ANC and the PA take each other out. But the PA can always play a spoiler role, and it just remains to be seen which party between the ANC and the DA it steals more of the vote from. It would be a turn up, and we know the PA throws a lot of resources into by-elections for the PA, if not to win, then to hurt the DA enough that the ANC could win with a plurality of the vote. I would still put the safe bet is on the DA retaining the ward. Anything can happen. Kokama, it's anyone's race. I would not be surprised if the PA won the ward from the ANC. I'd be a bit more surprised if the DA, currently in third place, won the ward. Again, I think for those last two wards, it's anyone's game.
Thanks, Paul. So I'm going to put my neck on the block, based on your great counsel. I think ANC definitely win the Makana ward. I think the DA do hold Kocha, and then I think the PA make it a second by-election win in Kokama. But let's see what happens on Wednesday night, Thursday morning. So let's go up country and go to Gauteng. So two wards. So Ward 90, City of Johannesburg, which I think is the Craighall area. It's a relatively safe ward for the DA. So in 2021, the DA won 70% to the ANC's 11, and in the 2024 provincial election, DA got 64, ANC got just under 10%. And I understand that it is just the ANC contesting the DA, so the DA won't have to worry about any sort of smaller parties splitting its vote. So probably a safe win. And then the more interesting one in Gauteng is Ward 10 in Merafong City. It is traditionally a safe ward, but this is going to be a very crowded field. So the ANC is contesting DA, MK, EFF, and interestingly, Action SA, who won't have contested this in 2021 because they didn't contest in Merafong. So in 2021, ANC won 75%, EFF second, just under 9%. In 2024, the ANC again got a pretty comfortable result, just under 70, EFF on 12, and MK registering about 6%. So, Paul, in respect of these two wards, what's your thinking? I would say DA probably with a very low turnout, differential turnout, pretty comprehensive win in Craighall, but I'm not going to pretend that I know what's going to happen in Merafong.
I think these two wards are a bit safer predictions, Jonathan. I do think the DA will retain Ward 19, City of Johannesburg. I think it's a good small referendum, possibly on where the ANC could be in Johannesburg, at least in a DA-controlled ward. I do expect the DA to win this. They could, a good night out for the DA would see them soaring up from about 65, 70% to above 80 or 85%, assuming that all those erstwhile voters that voted for any party other than the DA or the ANC decide to go with the DA. But I expect something similar to the last two results. Merafong, the ANC should retain this. The opposition parties should cancel each other out, even if the ANC lost some ground from 70% to closer to 60. I think this is a safe hold. Action SA haven't really contested Merafong before, but I'm interested to see if this is them leveraging their partnership with Forum for Service Delivery. In the 2021 election, Jonathan, Forum for Service Delivery just missed out on a PR seat, falling just below the UDM and the AIC. So I think this is another foray by Action SA to test the strength of this new partnership, to see how they can build on it. I'm interested in Action SA's result to see if they can translate the success that they had in the Northwest a couple of weeks ago closer to home.
Yeah, no, definitely. That is going to be very, very interesting to watch. Then let's go to KwaZulu-Natal, one by-election there, Ward 17 in the municipality of Mandeni. There, the ANC holds the ward and will be contesting against the IFP and MK. In 2021, the party won 65% of the vote. The IFP came in second with 16. But in 2024, where MK was in, MK won the ward with 72.6% to the ANC's 13 and the IFP's 11. So here, Paul, I suppose we've got an opportunity to look at this polling and see, can MK actually take this ward? So on the basis of 2024, it looks like MK should be able to win this ward from the ANC, but it may be significantly reduced and maybe a whole lot more of a tighter affair than it ordinarily would have been.
Yeah, I think the safe money is on MK winning this war, Jonathan. 73% in last year's provincial election is a bit of a pasting. They would have to have lost so much ground since then in just over a year to not win the ward. But as you say, will be interesting. We'll be able to maybe triangulate that result with the Social Research Foundation's poll, see if the two of them speak to each other.
Yeah. And also interesting to see what the turnout in that election is going to be, because maybe like the DA, MK in by-elections it contests is able to drive up differential turnout. So it'll be interesting to watch the enthusiasm in that particular ward. Then
if the trend is anything like other highly contested KZN wards where these three parties play, Jonathan, I expect the turnout to be pretty high.
Then ending in the Northern Cape. So there are two by-elections in the Northern Cape. The first one, Ward 7 in Huntham, which is going to be a very, very interesting by-election. So this is a four-way contest, DA, ANC, Freedom Front, and PA. The DA won this ward with 34.5% of the vote in 2021. The Freedom Front Plus came second with literally just under 30, 29.9, and the ANC with just under 21%. So that's Huntham, and then Ward 5, Siyankuma in the Northern Cape. ANC ward, they will be contesting against the DA, EFF, and PA. In 2021, the ANC won 56% of the vote. The DA got 21. But then in 2024, on the provincial ballots, the ANC went down to 42, the DA at 21, so holding its 21. But then the PA shot up with 10% and the EFF at 6%. So I think both of these wards, Paul, are very, very interesting, probably a little bit unpredictable, specifically with the PA coming in. And both, I suppose, will depend on good organizational efforts by the parties on the day.
Yeah, I think that's the key point, Jonathan. What can be very difficult about campaigning in the Northern Cape is, there are wide open spaces and relatively few registered voters. Huntham in particular, I think this ward has between 10 and 12 voting districts.
Yeah.
So campaigning is difficult. You are literally crisscrossing vast areas. And as you said, based on the results in 2021 in Huntham, it's quite a diverse,
Mm.
heterogeneous ward with the Freedom Front Plus coming in at 30%. I think, yeah, it's going to come down to which party is able to campaign better and in a more coordinated way. The Freedom Front Plus, for example, is probably not campaigning the entire length and breadth of this ward, but the ANC will have and I think they're going to have to fight hard. So the DA and the ANC will
Yeah.
have to fight hard, and this one very difficult to predict. Sianguma, again, it's a familiar story. The ANC are going to hope. I don't think the party will win a majority. They're going to have to hope that the DA and the PA and the EFF take each other out. But again, as you said, on the day, whoever is better organized, and we know we've said this before a few minutes ago, the PA tends to throw an incredible amount of resources into those wards it thinks it can win in by-elections. And it's got a pretty good success rate. So I do expect the ANC to retain Sianguma, but I think it's going to be quite close.
Yeah. Great. Well, we will have a discussion next week on the Real National Dialogue to unpack the actual results and try and pick up some trends. So, really going to be an exciting evening on Wednesday, early Thursday morning to see how these results do pan out. Thank you as ever to everybody for tuning in to the Real National Dialogue. We really appreciate the support. Please do like and subscribe and share as far and wide as you possibly can. And always feel free, and well, not feel free, we encourage you to send in some tips and suggestions for what you would like us to discuss. Paul, thank you very much as ever. And until next week, have a good one.
Always a pleasure, Jonathan. It has been an exciting week. Looking forward to unpacking the by-election results with you next week. And to all of our viewers and our readers and listeners, we should have a final bumper edition of the by-election review before the end of the year. Please visit the Substack and look out for our new publications.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Paul. Thanks, everyone.